As I sit at the head table this evening, I've been experiencing some deja vu. When the Constitution was last reformed, I sat on that commission as one of the commissioners. I'm not a lawyer. I was not a lawyer then, but I think since then I've learned quite a lot in terms of what Indigenous rights mean to us, what, as a commissioner, I proposed at that time, what still has not happened, and what still needs to happen for Indigenous people. We heard of women's rights, we heard of youth's rights, and now I would like to address a little bit, because 7 minutes is not enough to talk about the range of Indigenous issues, Indigenous rights issues that can be covered. I would like to address Indigenous heritage and what this means to us with regards to constitutional protections. Article 149G, and we heard reference earlier to 149E and the rest of it. Article 149G of the Guyana Constitution states, Indigenous peoples shall have the right to the protection, preservation, and promulgation of their languages, cultural heritage, and way of life. The same Constitution also values the special place in our nation of the Indigenous peoples and recognizes their right as citizens to land and security and to the promulgation of policies for their communities. This is stated in the preamble, and I heard reference to the preamble earlier as well. But what does this mean to us, and how does this translate into legislative protections? Does this really take into account our way of life as a people? Among Indigenous peoples, we have a common saying, our land, our culture, our ways of life. What does this mean? This is very important to us. It means that our land and our culture are intrinsically tied to each other. Hunting, fishing, farming, and gathering, among many other things, all form part of our culture. Time does not permit me to expand some more on how our ways of life are impacted by our land and how this is tied into our culture and how it takes into account our lives as a people. The reality when it comes to legislative protections is that while there are some legal recognition of our ways of life and rights to land, these do not address areas such as traditional land rights, and there is therefore a need for language in our Constitution that clearly articulates such rights, including relevant governance authority. And I'd like to expand here a little bit. The discussion on Indigenous land has constantly taken place whenever there's a collection or a meeting or a grouping of Indigenous people who come together. The first topic that is discussed is our land. And why do we talk about our land? Right? We have our communities that live in the savannah. We have our communities that live near to the rivers. We have our communities that live within the mountains and so forth. It is the land where our ancestors are buried. It is the land where we collect our plants for our medicine. It's the land that we utilize to build our homes. The rivers that run through our land, we depend on those water for the fish that we depend on for our food supply, for drinking water. Indigenous people where we live near rivers and are known to be good swimmers. We depend on that as a form of recreation. And there's so many areas in which the environment is important to us in the same way that other environments, like cars and high houses and so, are important to other people as well. Right? So I really want to stress, when we talk about land, it's our home, it's our pharmacy, it's our hunting, it's our supermarket and so forth. And this is really important, but it's not articulated in our Constitution. While we have Article 149G, where else can we apply to have the recognition of some of these areas that I mentioned for our people to really benefit? It's a hard task. It's a hard task. We have the Amerindian Act, but that too has its limitations, and therefore the Constitution, being the highest law of the land, of course, should seek to address and seek to incorporate these protections when it comes to our Indigenous peoples. I heard reference to the fourth schedule of the Constitution, and there are articles, there are conventions that are included in the fourth schedule that can also work towards the protection of our people. There are instances where there are protections already in place, but how are these translated into actions? There is need for the participation of our people. And I like the point made by the youth representative in terms of the system and representation for our Indigenous peoples. No harm to politicians here and the parties represented here, but for our Indigenous communities and for the administrative regions where our Indigenous communities inhabit, the people who we have representing us are not at the highest level of the National Assembly, are not necessarily the people who we appoint, the people who we want, and the people who are familiar with our issues. And that must be rectified. There are cases, there are precedents, like in Colombia, in New Zealand, where there are high percentage of Indigenous populations that they have tried. They have allocated seats specifically for Indigenous peoples. And I'm saying these must be, these precedents must be investigated and see how they can apply it to Guyana. Too often, we have our people being left out of discussions. And that brings me to the point of constitutional reform. Of course, I've been saying it's necessary because we need to articulate more on the rights of Indigenous peoples. In the last process, our people participated. We participated to a level, because you know what happened in the National Assembly as well. Who has the higher number sometimes are the ones who decide what goes forward. And therefore, in the participation of our people in the process, well, first of all, it has to happen. Like I said, too often our people are left out of the various processes, so constitutional reform is needed, the representation of our people is needed, the participation of our people is needed in the process. We always like to talk about free, prior, and informed consent. And what does that mean? It means that due regard have to be paid to us as a people who live in the interior, who do not have ready means of communication, who cannot daily communicate by telephone or other means. It's coming in, but it's still not there. Due regard have to be paid for the level of representation of our people and how they can adequately or not adequately represent as well. Time has to be a factor that has to be considered. Too often, 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, even might be allocated for an activity to take place. That is not enough sometimes for our people to get information, and I mean hard copy information as well, to read, to understand, and come back and have dialogue. Time is something that really has to be considered. And also, of course, in free, prior, and informed consent, saying no must also be taken into account. So I really want to stress the issue of free, prior, and informed consent when it comes to our people as well. I want to touch a little bit briefly on the Indigenous Peoples Commission, and I promise I'll finish here. During the time that I sat on the Constitution Reform Commission as well, and I see some familiar faces of people who were there at that time, an Indigenous Peoples Commission was also included in the Constitution. The name seems to say that Indigenous people will form the majority of the decision makers or the people who sit on this commission. In reality, if you look at the Constitution, 10 seats can be identified by entities. Who are the entities? They are not necessarily, or they may not necessarily come from among Indigenous peoples or Indigenous peoples representative. 2 from non-governmental organizations, and 3 from the Tushaus Council. 10 and 5 is 15. You have non-voting members as well. Who outweighs? Who could potentially outweigh when it comes to decision-making in a constitutional body? Representation is very important for us. We must be included. We must be all part of the decision-making process. Thank you.